So we are back here working on the book of Judges again. Let me start by asking, is there anything from last week that needs any clarification, or things that you kind of been that have kind of stuck with you over the last week, or anything we want to make sure we touch on before we plow ahead tonight? And if not, that's okay. That tells me we did a good job on the introduction. So we are going to be setting the scene tonight. We are going to look at the first 2.5 chapters of Judges, and that is going to give us the lay of the land in which the judges are operating, both to a certain extent the actual lay of the land geographically and politically, but also the theological issues that are going to be shaping the way the story is told. So we are going to start in chapter 1 of all places. Let's start. We're going to read 1 through 21. Let me ask Carol to read verses 1 through 7. Nick, if you could read 8 through 14. And Tom, if you could give us 15 through 21.
After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. I hereby give the land into his hand. Judah said to his brother Simeon, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. Then I too will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they were defeated, 10,000 of them at Bezek. They came upon Adonibezek at Bezek and fought against him, and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adonibezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adonibezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done. So God has paid me back. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there.
Then the people of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the people of Judah went down to fight against Canaanites who lived in the hill country in the Negev and in the lowland. Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there, they went up against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sephir. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sephir and takes it, I will give him my daughter Ashapha as wife. And Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, and he gave his daughter Asha as his wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from a donkey. Caleb said, as she dismounted from a donkey, Caleb said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, give me a present. Since you have sent me to the land of Negev, give me also Gulat-Maim. So Caleb gave her upper Gulat and lower Gulat.
The descendants of Hobab, the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad. Then they went and settled with the Amalekites. Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and devoted it to destruction. So the city was called Hormah. Judah took Gaza with its territory, Askelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the three sons of Anak. But the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day.
So, for those of you who have access to the handout, if you look on the map that is a part of that handout, you can see that Judah has the most territory geographically. They seem to be the biggest tribe. So their campaigns get the most ink here in chapter 1. So Judges begins, it picks up where Joshua has left off. Of course, Joshua tells the story of the people moving into and conquering the promised land. Has that land been completely conquered by the time that the book of Judges begins?
Obviously not.
Right, there are all variety of Canaanite peoples living there. In spite of the clear directive from God that has caused us a lot of discussion in the book of Joshua, this command for herem, sometimes translated as the ban, but that idea that they are supposed to really completely clear the land of anybody who was there, and that is not happening. Does Judah's campaign accomplish what the people are supposed to do there?
It doesn't really say whether they killed all the people or not. It says it took the land.
Right. They could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain. We see in verse 19 there. We also see that they could not drive out the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived there to this day. So we still have these other peoples living on the land. And of course, as we look at that in terms of history or politics, that we have one set of questions, but obviously to meet Judges on its own terms, we need to read it theologically. What is God's desire in this? And it is God's desire that these other peoples not be there. And we'll get into that more in a minute. So Judah has not carried out the directive that God revealed to Joshua. You need to come in and you need to wipe out everything and everyone. Let's see if the other tribes of Israel fare any better. Mark, will you share with us, please, chapter 1, verses 22 through 29, and then Kristen, can you take us 30 down through the bottom of the chapter there?
Mm-hmm.
The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel, The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." So he showed them the way into the city, and they put the city to the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. So the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and named it Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ableam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not, in fact, drive them out. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer.
Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahol, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon or Halab or Ekzib or of Helba or of Afrek or of Rehob, but the Asherites, is that right?
The
Say that.
Asherites, the tribe of
Asherite.
Asher.
The Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Antha, but lived among the Canaanites and the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and the Beth Anath became subject to forced labor for them. The Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continued to live in Heres, in Ajalon, and Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from ascent of, oh boy, Arkarim from Sela and upward. Wow, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. No, I appreciate everybody jumping in and doing whatever they can with some of these names that are very unfamiliar to us. So, what is the common thread that we see holding all of these brief accounts of the campaigns of the various different tribes together?
They're not getting rid of the Canaanites. The question I have is, it says that they did not drive them out. Were they supposed to destroy them, or were they supposed to just drive them out and drive them to where? Or did they take a look at it and go, well, you know what, we need somebody to build all our stuff, so why don't we just force them into labor?
Right.
I don't know.
I think as best I can tell, if they were not able to put them all to the sword, as we had seen described in Joshua, at least dispossessing them of the land, clearing the land out completely, whether that meant they ended up going off to the other side of the Jordan River, or they went up north into Syria or south into Egypt. I don't think it mattered, but that the land was supposed to be completely cleared of the people who were living there when they arrived. And so we'll see as we get a little further into the book why that matters. Um, Even if they say, they put them to forced labor, which, as many people have pointed out, these are people whose ancestors were liberated from forced labor in Egypt, and now they are imposing that on others. It's challenging to make sense of, but the the reason why it is more important to make these people go away in one way or another rather than keep them around, even if these people are enslaved, the direction from God is still none of these people can stay, and we'll get into that in a moment. Does that clarify it all?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, none of them are successful. In fact, by the time we get down to verse 34, the Amorites actually pressed the Danites. So the Danites are one of the tribes. They get pushed back into the hill country. So some of the tribes actually end up losing some territory. So they did not drive out the inhabitants. Who is the exception that proves the rule, though?
Ooh.
Was it Caleb, whose younger brother got got Ashka as his wife?
Um, yeah, so he was able to secure a piece of territory there, but in verses 22 through 26, we actually
Joseph.
find that the house of Joseph is successful in clearing these other peoples out of their territory. And so the people who were there, we mentioned where these people are supposed to go. The people who were in the city of Luz actually had pretty far north, and they end up in the land of the Hittites. And the Hittites were ancient people who lived in what was now Turkey. For those who are into classical antiquities, the Trojans of the Trojan War were actually a group of Hittites. So those people went far from where we're at here. So we have all of this campaigning going on, and pretty much with the exception of Joseph, none of these campaigns are successful in driving these people off the land. Why does this matter? Well, that is a matter that we will get to in chapter 2 here. But let me pause there. Questions, interpretations, thoughts?
I have two questions. First question, are we to assume there's all the casualties are on one side only? There's no friendly fire? Or Israelites getting killed? And second of all, when it says to this day, it means the day of the writing, which is 8th century BC, correct?
Yeah, probably somewhere. Yeah, somewhere in between the 8th and the 6th centuries. Yeah, so I mean, we're talking a long block of time that these people are still there. Um, I would have to assume that there are definitely casualties and deaths on the Israelite side as well, particularly because we find that the campaigns are not totally successful. If they were saying something like, the Lord went out ahead of them and drove these people out, then maybe we could assume that there was no bloodshed on the side of the Israelites. But I have to imagine that the fact that they could not drive these people off the land, I would have to assume there must have been uh, injuries and deaths on the Israelite side as well. So we touched on this a number of times throughout the book of Joshua, and the folks who wrote the book of Judges are kind enough to kind of frame this for us again at the beginning of the book of Judges. It likely to us sounds, it's hard for us to make sense of this idea of clear out the land completely. Nobody stays. Whether they leave and they go live with the Hittites or whether they get killed doesn't really matter as long as they're all gone. Why is that a problem? Because it is not a political or economic or even military consideration. It is a covenant consideration. So remember, we touched on last week that the role of judge, really at the heart of it, has to do with faithfulness to the covenant. And so leaving these people on the land brings us into trouble with that. That really becomes the problem here. So I will read chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, and then Carol, if you could jump in with 6 through 10. And so Judges 2, starting at verse 1. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from the land of Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord.
Joshua dismissed the people. The Israelites all went to their own inheritances to take possession of the land. The people worshiped the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath Herems, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Moreover, that the whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel.
So this helps us understand why these other peoples being on the land is such a problem. What is the problem that the author points out with the way the people have been approaching the conquest of the land?
They need to
They're not
obey
destroying their religious beliefs that they are living in. Their altars aren't being destroyed. They are like letting them live believing in their gods or their idols, or they're not
Yeah,
destroying that part of their culture.
there is an express commandment. If there are objects that people use to worship other gods that they have built here, those need to be torn down. Again, if there are few blanket statements we can make that are true all through the Old Testament, let alone all of Scripture, no other gods. So the express instruction is tear down these altars. And what do the people do?
to worship the idols.
Yeah, they sure do not tear down those altars. And so what does God do in response to the people's unfaithfulness?
He makes the adversaries take over.
Yeah, he says, I will not drive these people out before you. They will be your adversaries. Their gods will be a snare. So God says, I'm going to leave these people here. And yes, it is going to become the cause of conflict. That is the reason why God has said, clear everybody off the land and tear down the altars. Their gods are going to be a trap. It is going to be something that is a constant temptation for the people to worship these other gods. And as we said last week and at other occasions as well, this is still relevant to us, not so much that there are necessarily altars to many other gods all over the place, but whatever it is that our heart truly desires and puts its trust in, whatever we are willing to sacrifice to, that is our God. And there are many things that fit that definition. People make gods of themselves. People make gods of wealth. People make gods of power, of fame. So this idea of the temptation to worship other gods and how faithfully we can abide by this covenant, and I think for us as Christians, that covenant would be rooted in baptism and rooted in communion. We still use that covenant language. It is still as pressing of an issue in our generation as it was for people in the time of Judges. So God says, I'm going to leave these people here, and it is going to continue to be problematic for you. And because these people are here, their gods that they worship are in effect still going to be here, and that will be a temptation to you. Now the wheels have not completely come off yet. What keeps the people at least a little bit on a faithful path?
Joshua?
Right. So Joshua and his generation, Joshua lived through the time of the Exodus and saw that. And people of his generation lived through many of the conquests that Joshua took part in, places like Jericho, where they saw what God had done. So that presence of the older generation helps the people keep the faith. But what does Judges have to say about the new generation that comes up after them?
They don't know the work that was done for Israel. It's like they stopped telling their story, their history.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah, and that's also kind of hard to grapple with. It would have been the sort of history and story that that Joshua's generation, I think, would have probably done a lot to impress on the younger generation, and yet they had not seen what God had done, and for whatever reason, they did not let that impact how they lived and how they worshipped. And again, this is probably something that in different ways and shapes and forms is still relevant. Every generation looks at the generation that comes after them and assumes that, yep, this is going to be the generation that is just the end. These people are going to be the worst thing ever. And some of us look to previous generations and say the same thing. Um, so let me tell you about these punk kids that are out there these days. Um,
you
But
So-
the case is for verse 10 though, which is saying, exactly what you said, but the question would be why, and perhaps the why is that they didn't drive these people out and they were turned more toward them as opposed to their own faith. I mean, what caused that to happen in verse 10? It to me is the big question.
yeah,
Because whether they had driven them out or not, if they had not had any interest in telling the story and in keeping the faith, so to speak, what good would that have been?
Right.
Unless the two were linked.
Yeah, and maybe there is something to what you said about, because the other peoples were not driven out, it's a lot easier to look at people who are actually here. It's a lot easier to look to my neighbors and see what they're doing than it is to, in my mind, look back to the previous generation and say, what were they doing? So that probably is a piece of it. Did Joshua's generation do a poor job telling the story? Did they not pass the history along in a faithful way? Um, as I
They,
have said before, I don't know. I wasn't there, but
they could be the modern day baby boomers, or could have been, or the old,
mhm,
or a simile.
There's
Yeah,
no
it's
eyewitnesses left.
that's right. Um, so yeah, and it is interesting that Judges doesn't really comment on that. Just says this generation didn't know the work God had done. Um, we have lots of commandments. You will observe this Passover celebration every year. You will make time to tell the story. Um, was that not going on? Were people just not receptive to the tradition? Um, all fascinating questions. Um, and as people have said about Christianity, I think is true about Judaism and many faiths probably, but people have said the church is always one generation away from extinction. If the faith is not passed on, yeah. But yes, unfortunately for us, Judges is uh, does not offer us any insight on that.
Another question I have is, in a couple of the lines at the beginning, actually, where it says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up,"
Mhm.
are we talking about Joshua, or an angel spoke to Joshua?
I think an angel spoke to some of the people who were gathered together. So when the angel spoke these words to all the Israelites, but this is definitely
Yeah,
a messenger who has come from God to deliver this message. It is not Joshua.
okay.
Hmm.
Which again, you would think the presence of an angel would also spur some memory among the people.
Mhm.
So as we touched on last week, and this will be a little bit of a review, but it's a very important concept for how we understand this book. In the middle of chapter 2 here, Judges gives us a very good pattern that we can use, and this pattern is going to repeat itself throughout the rest of the book. And there are kind of 4 key pieces to this pattern, and we looked at them last week, but I want to go over them again because it is such a key part of how this story is told. Uh, Nick, could I have you share with us, please, chapter 2, verses 11 through 15? And Tom, if you could share with us 16 down to 23.
Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord in anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and Ashtoreth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into power of their enemies all around them, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress.
Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them, and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. In order to test Israel whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did, the Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua.
We have kind of four primary movements that go on here to make up this pattern. What is the first thing that happens in this story that is going to repeat itself?
They follow other gods.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they do evil in the sight of the Lord by worshiping other gods. And what happens as a consequence of that?
They get plundered.
Yeah, God uses the other peoples around them to punish them. And they are conquered or oppressed by the peoples who are around them. These peoples that they did not drive off the land initially. What happens next? The people are being oppressed by these plunderers or these other nations, and what happens?
God brings them the example of these judges that, try to help them, start to follow their ways. Like, this is the way, you should be living.
Yep.
But when
And the
but when they die and get old and die, they go back to their old ways again. It's like they need somebody to hold their hand all the time.
right. So God raises up the judge in response to the people's crying out to him.
Is for
The
help.
judge delivers the people, and then once the judge has died, the people go right back to worshiping other gods. In fact, it says they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors. So it's like with each time, the people don't come back quite as far to faithfulness. They drop a little bit further each time. So this pattern, the Israelites do what is evil in the sight of the Lord and worship other gods. God hands them over to the power of their enemies. God raises up a judge to deliver the people. When the judge has delivered them and the judge is no longer in the picture, people start worshiping other gods again. We're going to see that pattern repeat itself throughout the book, particularly next week as we get into the actual accounts of who the judges are and what they do. To bring us right up to the cusp of that, we're going to turn the page to chapter 3 here, and there is a little bit of an introduction here before we get to the ministry of the first judge, Othniel. Mark, will you share with us, please, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6?
Esther, before we proceed, can I ask a couple
Yes,
of questions?
of course.
The verse 23 says, Lord left these nations, not driving them out as once, and had not handed them over to Joshua, which means that was a purpose on why Joshua did not drive him out, to test the faith of the. So it's not our blame of Joshua. It's meant to be left behind.
Hmm.
Okay. Second of all, verse 10 indicates that the younger generation don't know anything about God. Did that lead to this problem of worshiping Baals?
That is certainly what Judges is telling us. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived him. Um, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors. The next generation who came after them did not know the Lord. So it's kind of like when the last witnesses to some of these things God had done were no longer there as a reminder or a presence. Kind of the memory of what God had done faded along with them.
Thank you.
I think one could also make the argument going, way back to early in chapter 2, is where it's stated in verse 2, for your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants, besides, not tearing down their altars, but they did make a covenant with the inhabitants, because in many sections in chapter 1, they talked about them working for them. In other words, forced labor, but I mean, it's a covenant, so to speak, that to me, the fact that they had them working for them was also a violation of God's commandment.
Yeah, they were not supposed to be there at all, whether they are
But
contract workers or enslaved people or whatever.
right.
Yeah, they're not supposed to be there at all. And in fact, as we get into chapter 3, we'll see even some other ways that God's people have disregarded that command, not to be in covenant with these folks.
So
Any other questions on chapter 2? All right. Mark, will you share with us, please, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6?
now these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on Mount Lebanon from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath, they were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods.
As we know, that is really not okay. Um, why does, and we saw this at the end of chapter 2, but it's really put very clearly here, why does God leave these peoples on the land?
To test them.
Yeah, this is an opportunity. Are the people going to choose to honor the covenant, or are they going to choose to kind of go after what they want to do? And are they going to obey the commandments of the Lord? And they don't, because what do the Israelites do with these people who are left on the land?
They marry among them.
Yeah.
yeah, they start intermarrying. So again, this
Start
is
worshiping their gods.
yep, this is one way of making covenant with your neighbors. You are entering into that covenant of marriage and worshiping their gods. That is really bad news. Um, so yeah, the people are not uh, honoring that command. You know, do not make a covenant with these people. Marrying them is in a very real sense making a covenant, because again, marriage also represented the joining of families or clans. It's not simply two individuals, but kind of the joining of families and clans and other familial structures. So yeah, that's problematic, and obviously worshiping other gods. I mean, it is the first commandment, people. Yeah. And again, before
Thank you.
before we get too self-righteous about they were worshiping other gods. Again, there are many gods that we are tempted to, and to an extent do worship. We probably don't call them Baal or Astarte or whatever, but they are things we look to for life and that we sacrifice to, but are not the God of Abraham. So again, this is relevant to us in a faith context as well as in others. In addition to that, questions? If you want to just briefly take a look at your map that is on the handout there, this is really just to help give an idea of many of these names that we hear, just so you have an idea of where these things are going on. But you can see on this map that the judges are distributed pretty well geographically. So the idea that we were working with last week, that judges to a certain extent reflects a collection of traditions from across the 12 tribes that seems to be reflected as we look at the geography of it. They're not all clustered in one part or another. So they are distributed across the whole of the 12 tribes there. Um, and again, just to give a little bit of context about where these things are going on and where some of these other peoples are. And something that occurred to me, and I'll just throw this out there for discussion, or if it offers anybody some insight, that would be wonderful. But in chapter 3, when they're talking about the intermarriage and the way that changes people coming into a land, something that's maybe a little closer to home for many of us is the difference between how what is now the United States was colonized versus how Latin America was colonized, in that the English tended to come as families, and when the English came, they married other English people, so they had English children, and so on and so on. And in the United States, the the expansion of the European settled part of the country really was a policy of, we are removing the people from the land. And in the United States today, probably with the exception of a lot of place names, the the impact of the people who were living here first, um, that culture has been very much obliterated. Whereas in lots of parts of Latin America, the Spanish often sent just men. And so they intermarried with the people who were there. So rather than in the United States, where you have um, predominantly European people kind of taking over the whole territory. In Latin America, you have kind of people who have Spanish ancestry and native ancestry, and it's created a new distinct culture. So that idea of, if we want to maintain, for the purposes of God saying, you Israelites are going to be my chosen people who I am giving this special responsibility to, needing to maintain that identity was really crucially important. So the idea of intermarrying is problematic because it is more difficult to maintain that identity, kind of the more different cultural inputs you have coming into the people. And I am in no way endorsing how much of United States history took place. Please hear me say that. But just kind of the parallel of what happens when you kind of stick with your own people compared to what happens when you intermarry with the people who are there. We can see kind of starkly in the United States versus, say, in Mexico or Central America or something like that. So there. So just briefly, so people have an idea of where we are going. Next week, we are going to start getting into the accounts of who the judges are and what they do. So we are going to be seeing that pattern we talked about earlier. We are actually going to see that in action, and we will be dealing with the judges, some of whom are pretty well known, others are a little more obscure, but that is going to take the bulk of our time studying judges. We'll be actually looking at who they are and what they do. So that is where we are headed from here. But let me ask questions, insights, thoughts, reflections on kind of what we've touched on so far.
On this map, at the core of it all, like where you're looking through Ephraim and Dan and Zebulun and all that, was that like land that had been, well, okay, I guess I'm answering my own my own question, I guess. But these tribal lands at this point, where did they get established? They only got established after the Exodus, correct? Because before Egypt, there was just Joseph and the sons, right? There were no tribes, obviously. So
Right.
so
And
how did these areas of tribes get established? Okay, so I guess they got established during the book of Joshua, but these groups that you have on the outside were really all intermingled, even within all the areas of tribe. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, like, the area of Dan, which you would say that's like the heart of Israel, but that also had these foreigners or these original occupants living in it as well. Is that safe to say?
yep.
There was
And
no
yes,
there was no pure tribes of Israel at this time.
so what so yes, you are absolutely correct in that a good chunk of the book of Joshua is Joshua assigning the tribes their territories. So those are all spelled out in the book of Joshua. This is how God wants us to allot the territory. And yes, we have the Philistines and the Jebusites. I do know. So the Philistines were definitely very much overlapping with where Judah and Dan and Ephraim were, a lot along the coast. Um, there is reason to think that they are probably somehow related to Phoenicians, probably seafaring peoples. So obviously they would want to stick a little more to the coast. And the Jebusites, we know, were the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. So right there around Benjamin, Judah, Ephraim, where all of them come together, there were definitely Jebusites in there, because we know they were in Jerusalem. So yes, there were, even though on the map they're written, kind of on the fringes here, several of them were kind of scattered throughout. The Moabites and the Ammonites were kind of off to the east. But yeah, certainly some of these peoples that we hear about and will hear about in Judges, they were not off to the side. They were kind of in the middle.
Okay, thanks.
Is conformingtojesus.com a free website?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. I did want to make sure that I attributed the map to where I got it from. I searched, and this seemed to be the map that kind of laid it out the nicest for us.
It
I
is
did not.
good. No, it is good. It's a very good map.
Right. I did not go through and really explore any other content on the website, so I cannot vouch for anything else on it. But they do produce a very fine map for the Book of Judges. So that is what I have for you tonight. We will be back next week and actually get into the meat of the book. Now that we have set the scene pretty solidly and kind of know what to look for as we go. So I think we will find a lot of the stories. They will definitely provoke discussion. I think we will find a lot of them pretty entertaining as well. Um, so we will get on that next week. Any final questions or thoughts? And if not, would someone please pray the Lord's Prayer on behalf of the group?
I will.
Thank you.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for your insight and willingness to dig a little deeper. And we'll see everybody back here soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Pastor.
Good night.
Good
Night.
night.
Bye.